Have you ever wondered what happens when God feels completely gone? When every prayer echoes back empty and you question whether he was ever there at all? When the silence becomes so heavy, you wonder if you made the whole thing up in your head? Throughout centuries, millions have walked away from faith during these dark stretches. They felt abandoned. They interpreted the silence as rejection. They took the emptiness as proof that God never existed. But what if everything you think you know about spiritual dryness is backwards? There was a woman in 16th century Spain who lived through 18 straight years of this crushing spiritual darkness. Not 18 days, not 18 months. 18 years of prayer that felt like talking to a wall. 18 years of feeling completely cut off. 18 years of wondering if she had wasted her entire life chasing a lie. Her name was Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda d'Avila y Ahumada, born March 28, 1515 in Avila, Spain, but history remembers her simply as Teresa of Avila. And what happened to her at the end of those 18 years would change everything we understand about God's presence in the darkness. Teresa's mother died when she was 15. One sister, one brother, 8 other siblings, a merchant father from Toledo who was rigidly honest and painfully strict. The kind of household where you always felt like you were doing something wrong no matter what you chose. Her mother loved romance novels but had to hide them from her husband. Teresa loved them too. Her father told her never to lie. Her mother told her not to tell her father. The girl was trapped in the middle, terrified that every choice was the wrong one. At 20 years old, in 1535, Teresa joined the Carmelite order, not because she felt called, not because she burned with holy fire. She entered the convent because, as she wrote later, she wanted to choose the safest course. Insurance against hell, a calculated move. November 2nd, 1536, she entered the convent of the Incarnation in Avila as a novice. 140 nuns lived there. November the 3rd, 1537, she took her vows. 1 year later, autumn of 1538, before 2 years had passed, her health collapsed. If you value documented Catholic history and saint stories like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from Teresa's own autobiography, The Life of Teresa of Jesus, completed in 1565, along with documentation preserved in the interior castle, written in 1577 specifically from June 2nd to November 29th, with a 5-month interruption. These are her own words, under obedience to her confessors, not legends or secondhand tales. Now back to the information. Winter began. Teresa went to stay with her half-sister, Dona Maria de Cepeda de Barrientos, at the village of Castellanos de la Canada. On the way there, she stopped at Hortigosa with her uncle, Don Pedro de Cepeda. He gave her a book, Osuna's Third Spiritual Alphabet, April to July 1539. Treatment at Becetas, August 15th, 1539. An attack of catalepsy struck her down. She was helpless for more than 8 months, paralyzed. About Easter, 1540, she returned to the Incarnation, an invalid until late in 1541. The paralysis lasted 3 years. The effects remained until summer 1542, and came back intermittently until about 1554. December 24th, 1543. Her father died, Don Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda. Gone. And then came the 18 years, 1537 to 1555. Teresa tried to pray. She wrote, "I tried as hard as I could to keep Jesus Christ present within me. My imagination is so dull that I had no talent for imagining or coming up with great theological thoughts." She prayed this way off and on for 18 years without feeling that she was getting results. Nothing. Silence. Emptiness. "This intellect is so wild," she wrote, "that it doesn't seem to be anything else than a frantic madman no one can tie down." The convent was not the refuge she expected. Many women who had no place else to go wound up there whether they had vocations or not. They were encouraged to stay away for long periods to cut down on expenses. Nuns would arrange their veils attractively and wear jewelry. Prestige depended not on piety but on money. There was a steady stream of visitors in the parlor and parties that included young men. What spiritual life there was involved hysteria, weeping, exaggerated penance, nosebleeds, and self-induced visions that had nothing to do with God. Teresa tried to pray. She tried to feel something, anything. The silence crushed her. She wrote later, "I don't know what heavy penance I would not have gladly undertaken rather than practice prayer. Prayer felt like torture, a daily reminder that God was not there, or that he was there and had decided she wasn't worth answering." She wrote, "All the trials we endure cannot be compared to these interior battles." She abandoned prayer entirely for a while. She lived an outwardly devout life, but inside she had compromised. She had given up. She went through the motions, attended services, followed the rules, but the connection was dead. The line was cut. She felt nothing. 1555. Teresa was 38 years old, almost 2 decades of spiritual emptiness behind her, almost 2 decades of feeling like a fraud in a nun's habit. She was walking toward the convent's chapel. Someone had set aside a statue for an upcoming celebration. The statue depicted Christ being scourged at the pillar, Christ sorely wounded, bleeding, beaten, torn apart. Teresa saw it, and something inside her shattered. She threw herself down in front of the statue. Floods of tears. She couldn't stop. Years of holding everything together came apart in that moment. She begged him, "Give me strength to serve you." That's all she could say. "Give me strength." That was the conversion. That was the break. Not a voice from heaven, not a flash of light. Just a statue of a wounded man and a woman who finally understood that she was the one who had been absent, not God. Immediately after, everything changed. She stopped spending hours chatting in the parlor. She gave up all concern about her health. She devoted long hours to prayer. And then the Lord began to flood her with mystical experiences. Not because she earned them, not because she finally did something right. They came because God had been waiting for her to stop running. Francis Borgia heard her confession in 1555. He told her plainly, "The Spirit of God is working in you. Concentrate on Christ's passion. Do not resist the ecstatic experience that comes." But the mystical experiences terrified her. 1555 to 1556. She began to think she was sometimes being addressed by interior voices and to see certain visions and experience revelations. She saw with the eyes of the soul. She never saw anything with her bodily eyes, never heard anything with her bodily ears. Twice she thinks she heard a voice but understood not what was said. The visions passed away like a meteor most frequently, but they remained impressed on her mind and produced such effects that it was as if she saw those things with her bodily eyes, and more. One confessor was so sure the visions were from the devil that he told her to make an obscene gesture called the fig every time she had a vision of Jesus. She cringed, but she did as she was ordered, all the time apologizing to Jesus. Fortunately, Jesus didn't seem upset. He told her she was right to obey her confessor. She wrote later, "I'm more afraid of those who are terrified of the devil than I am of the devil himself." Her friends, Francisco de Salcedo and Gaspar Daza, thought her favors were the work of the devil. Diego de Chitina, a Jesuit, brought her comfort by encouraging her to continue in mental prayer and to think upon the humanity of Christ. The visions continued. Teresa saw Christ with the eyes of the soul. She describes the difference between these visions and a human image as the difference between life and death. If what is seen is an image, it is a living image, not a dead man, but the living Christ. And he makes it known that he is both man and God, not as he was in the tomb, but as he was when he came out of the tomb after his resurrection. Sometimes he comes with such great majesty that no one could doubt but that it is the Lord himself, especially after receiving communion, for we know that he is present, since our faith tells us this. He reveals himself as so much the Lord of this dwelling that it seems the soul is completely dissolved, and it sees itself consumed in Christ. She wrote that majesty and beauty remain so impressed that they are unforgettable. The soul undergoes a change. It is always absorbed. It seems that a new, living, high degree of love is beginning, but here is what most people miss. Here's what changes everything about those 18 years of darkness. After those 18 years of spiritual dryness, after the conversion in 1555, after the visions began, our Lord appeared to her in a vision. And Teresa, finally able to speak to him face to face after all those years of silence, asked him a question. "Where have you been all these years?" Jesus answered. "I was closer to you then than I am now, closer in the darkness than in the light, closer in the silence than in the visions, closer when she felt abandoned than when she felt embraced." That answer has echoed through centuries of Christian mysticism. It contradicts everything we think we know about God's presence. We believe that when we feel God, he is close. When we don't feel God, he is left. But Teresa's experience reveals the opposite. The darkness was not absence. The darkness was overwhelming presence. A God so close that her finite soul couldn't process it. God so near that her human senses shut down under the weight. This is the concept Christian mystics call the dark night of the soul. St. John of the Cross, Teresa's contemporary and fellow reformer of the Carmelite order, wrote extensively about it. He identified it by name, distinguishing it from melancholy or depression. It is not a chemical imbalance. It is not a mental health crisis. It is the shadow cast in the soul by the overwhelming light of God's presence. God utterly present and yet utterly hidden. His intimate, purifying love experienced as a devastating absence, and even on occasion as a complete abandonment. This is not something that happens to lukewarm believers. Only a person who has felt the friendship and intimacy of God can experience the pain and agony of the absence of God. Only the person who loves deeply, or is deeply loved, knows what the absence of the beloved really means. The dark night of the soul is the soul being called to experience God in a new kind of way. No longer experiencing him through feelings or images, but now nakedly through blind faith. This darkness can achieve what years of study cannot. Faith grows as the soul realizes that God is absolute mystery, the great unknowable, yet absolutely real. The soul finds itself entering into a new kind of prayer, a prayer without images or feelings, whereby it proceeds to God rather by unknowing than knowing. This is the beginning of the unitive way, the way of passive contemplation. It is where the soul does apparently nothing, but where God does whatever he wills with it. The only road to this new kind of prayer is the road of the dark night through the deep valley of loneliness, as the soul blindly trusts and follows the Lord. Darkness leads to the mountaintop, where God, the dawn of a new day, is discovered. Teresa understood this eventually. She understood that those 18 years were not wasted. They were the crucible, the fire that burned away everything false, the silence that taught her to stop seeking feelings and start seeking God himself. After the visions began, after the mystical experiences flooded her life, Teresa wrote about what prayer actually is. For mental prayer, in my opinion, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him, who we know loves us. The important thing is not to think much, but to love much, and so do that which best stirs you to love. Love is not great delight, but desire to please God in everything. She wrote The Interior Castle in 1577, started June 2nd, Trinity Sunday, completed November 29th, the eve of St. Andrew's Day, a 5 months interruption in the middle, effectively a fortnight each for the first and second halves of the book. She was 62 years old. Her health, never good, was growing progressively worse. She did not want to write another book. She prayed, "Beloved, I have no idea what to say here. If you want me to do this thing, you're going to have to speak through me." God gave her a vision, a luminous crystal castle inside the human soul, 7 chambers, 7 mansions, each representing a different stage in the development of the soul. The journey to union with the Beloved is a journey home to the center of ourselves. The human soul is so glorious that God himself chooses it as his dwelling place. The first 3 mansions are where the soul actively works: devotion of the heart, vocal prayer, mental prayer, the prayer of recollection, the soul striving through conscious effort to reach God. The 4th mansion is where everything shifts. The supernatural element of the mystical life first enters. It is no longer by its own efforts that the soul is acquiring anything. God takes over. The senses and mind are stilled in what Teresa names the prayer of quiet. Up until now, the soul has been striving. In the 4th dwelling, the soul begins to experience someone else as the doer. The 5th mansion contains incipient union, in which the soul prepares itself to receive gifts from God. If the 5th mansion can be compared to a betrothal, the 6th mansion can be compared to lovers. The soul spends increasing amounts of time torn between favors from God and from outside afflictions. The soul knows she was in God and God was in her. The 7th mansion is spiritual marriage. The soul achieves clarity in prayer in a spiritual marriage with God. A spiritual vision of the Trinity is Teresa's entry into the spiritual marriage of the 7th mansion. Anguish, restlessness, and longing are transformed into the tranquil certitude of resting habitually in God's presence. The previous highs of rapture and lows of aridity vanish as the active Martha and contemplative Mary live harmoniously. The mystical state is realized wherein the soul is transformed, its will brought into conformity with the will of God. Prayer, which Teresa elsewhere says is simply talking with God, has been transformed from such events as a moment of recollection or an hour of rapture into an uninterrupted conversation with her beloved companion. Like rain falling into an infinite sea, all boundaries between the soul and God melt. Union, by definition, transcends the subject-object distinction. There is no longer any lover left to enjoy her beloved. There is only love, but before death and ultimate union, the soul must let ego bring it back to the ordinary world, to the seeming separateness of individual life. There is a lasting transformation. The soul who has dissolved into God reemerges with a vibrant wakefulness. There is now a permanent place of peace from which the soul can approach day-to-day tasks and responsibilities. The soul knows the Beloved lives inside and will never leave. But the dark night never fully ended for some mystics. Mother Teresa of Calcutta experienced something similar. February 28th, 1957, she wrote, "There is so much contradiction in my soul, such deep longing for God, so deep that it is painful, a suffering continual and yet not wanted by God, repulsed, empty, no faith, no love, no zeal." May 17th, 1964, she described the state of her soul with these astonishing words: "To be in love and yet not to love, to live by faith and yet not to believe, to spend myself and yet be in total darkness." The darkness lasted over 50 years for Mother Teresa. Father Joseph Neuner, her spiritual director, told her in 1961 that her dark night could have been an invitation from God. Perhaps he had called her to identify with abandonment, that of the poor, or which Christ experienced on the cross, and share in his redemptive suffering. Mother Teresa wrote to a priest, "If I ever become a saint, I will surely be one of darkness." This darkness was not an experience of depression or despair. Rather, it was the shadow cast in her soul by the overwhelming light of God's presence, God utterly present and yet utterly hidden. His intimate, purifying love experienced as a devastating absence, and even, on occasion, as a complete abandonment. She came to regard the darkness not only as a share in Christ's passion, but also, in some sense, as the spiritual side of her apostolate. She wrote, "I have come to love the darkness, for I believe now that it is a very, very small part of Jesus' darkness and pain on earth." To Bishop William Curlin, at their last meeting in 1995, she remarked, and repeated several times, "What a wonderful gift from God to be able to offer him the emptiness I feel. I am so happy to give him this gift." For Mother Teresa, the gift was wonderful, first of all because it underlined her intimate communion with God, but also because she realized that her experience of the dark night, her feeling of being unloved and unwanted, could help in some way to unite her more closely with the poorest of the poor. She wrote, "Let him do with me whatever he wants. If my darkness is light to some soul, the darkness, when understood correctly, is not a sign of God's absence, but of his overwhelming presence. The soul cannot see the sun because it is standing too close to it. The light blinds instead of illuminates. The warmth becomes unbearable heat. The presence becomes too much for finite human consciousness to process. And so it registers as absence. This is why Jesus told Teresa, 'I was closer to you then than I am now.' The 18 years of silence were not God pulling away. They were God pressing so close that Teresa's soul had to be purified, expanded, transformed before it could handle the weight of his presence. Think about it this way. When you look directly at the sun, you go blind, not because the sun disappeared, because it's too much. The darkness in your vision is proof of the sun's overwhelming brightness, not proof of its absence. The dark night is the soul going blind from looking too directly at the light of God." Teresa's experience gives us a roadmap for understanding our own spiritual dryness. When prayer feels empty, when God feels distant, when the silence becomes crushing, we have two options. We can interpret it as abandonment and walk away, or we can recognize it as the dark night, the place where God is so close that our human faculties shut down under the pressure. The distinguishing marks of the true dark night, as opposed to depression or spiritual laziness, are these. First, the soul maintains its desire for God even when it feels nothing. Second, the soul continues to avoid sin and practice virtue despite the lack of consolation. Third, the soul emerges more humble, more patient, more loving than before. Fourth, the soul experiences increasing distress at the idea of offending God. Fifth, the soul has no interest in created things and finds no comfort anywhere except in the thought of God, even though that thought brings pain. Depression does not produce these fruits. Depression pulls inward. Depression seeks comfort in created things. Depression leads to despair and giving up. The dark night, paradoxically, produces growth, even though it feels like death. The dark night leads to transformation, even though it feels like destruction. Teresa lived this. After those 18 years, after the conversion, after the visions, she set herself to the reformation of the Carmelite order. April 11th, 1562, she founded the first convent of discalced Carmelite nuns, the convent of St. Joseph at Avila. She founded 32 reformed convents in total, despite heavy opposition and constant difficulties. Truly wonderful were the exterior and interior manifestations of her mystical union with God, especially during the last decade of her life. These graces reached a climax when her heart was transfixed, the Transverberatio Cordis, an event commemorated in the Carmelite order by a special feast on August 27th. She described it in her autobiography. "I saw an angel close by me on my left side in bodily form. He was not large, but small of stature and most beautiful, his face burning as if he were one of the highest angels who seemed to be all of fire. In his hands I saw a great golden spear, and at the iron's point there appeared to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart, and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it." Bernini's famous sculpture, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, captures this moment. Some consider it highly eroticized. But Teresa's own description makes clear that the pain and the ecstasy were both real, both overwhelming, both inseparable from her union with God. She traveled constantly. Founded convents in Medina del Campo, Malagón, Valladolid, Toledo, Pastrana, Salamanca, Alba de Tormes, Segovia, Beas, Seville, Caravaca, Villanueva de la Jara, Palencia, Soria, Granada, Burgos. She left Burgos at the end of July 1582, stopped at Palencia, Valladolid, Medina del Campo, reached Alba de Torres in September, suffering intensely. Soon she took to her bed and passed away on October 4th, 1582. The following day, owing to the reform of the calendar, was reckoned as October 15th. After some years, her body was transferred to Avila, but later reconveyed to Alba, where it is still preserved incorrupt. 40 years after her death, in 1622, she was canonized by Pope Gregory XV. September 27, 1970, Pope Paul VI named her a Doctor of the Church, one of the first 2 women to receive this title, along with Catherine of Siena. Her books, The Life of Teresa of Jesus, The Interior Castle, and The Way of Perfection, are integral parts of Spanish Renaissance literature, as well as Christian mysticism and Christian meditation practices. They have nourished the Church for almost 5 centuries. They continue to guide souls through the dark night, because here is what Teresa understood and what she tried to teach. The dark night is not punishment. It is not abandonment. It is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. It is evidence that God is doing something right. He is purifying you, expanding your capacity, preparing you for a deeper union than you could have imagined. The darkness is the cocoon, the silence is the chrysalis. What feels like death is actually transformation. Teresa wrote, God desires that if we are going to please him and receive his great favors, we must do so through the most sacred humanity of Christ, in whom he takes his delight. I would not want anyone to think that there are times when we should not be thinking of him. If the vision and understanding of him should cease for a necessary period, there should at least remain the understanding that he is present. The soul should not leave the side of Christ our Lord. It should not turn its back on him. This is what I have experienced. She also wrote, Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing away. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. This is the legacy of Teresa of Avila, a woman who spent 18 years in crushing spiritual darkness and emerged to discover that God had been closer in the silence than he ever was in the visions. A woman who transformed her pain into a roadmap for millions of souls who would walk the same dark path after her. A woman who proved that feeling abandoned by God and being abandoned by God are 2 completely different things. The dark night is real. The pain is real. The silence is real. But so is the presence of God in the midst of it, closer in the darkness than in the light, closer in the silence than in the consolations, working invisibly, patiently, relentlessly to transform the soul into something capable of bearing the full weight of divine love. When Teresa finally saw Jesus face to face after those 18 years, she asked where he had been. His answer changed everything. I was closer to you then than I am now. Not because the visions were less real than the silence, because the silence was the place where he was doing his deepest work. The darkness was the place where he was most intimately present. The abandonment was the illusion. The presence was the reality. And so when you find yourself in the dark night, when prayer feels empty, when God feels distant, when the silence crushes you, remember Teresa. Remember that the darkness is not absence. It is presence so overwhelming that your finite soul registers it as nothing. Remember that God is closest when he feels farthest. Remember that the dark night is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of transformation. Teresa died October 4th, 1582, at 67 years old. She had spent 27 years in mystical union with God, 27 years of visions, ecstasies, revelations. But when she looked back on her life, she knew the truth. The 18 years of silence were just as important as the 27 years of light, maybe more important, because the silence taught her what the light never could. That God's presence does not depend on her ability to feel it, that union with God is not about consolations or visions or ecstasies. It is about naked faith in the darkness. It is about trusting that he is there when every sense screams that he is not. In 1561, at age 46, Teresa wrote in one of her letters about the paradox of the spiritual life. She wrote, "Though he slay me, I will wait for him. We must cry out, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." We must place ourselves in simple openness to God's mercy, allow ourselves to be turned inside out and rendered absolutely helpless before God's power and grace. She also wrote to her sisters in the Reformed Carmelite convents, giving them advice for the dark nights they would inevitably face. While you may experience desolation of God's felt presence of the senses, you're being purged and drawn closer to God, but you don't feel that you are while you're experiencing that. The knowing bypasses our finite intellect and consciousness, so we can know that we know God, yet we may spend our lives in a spiritual aridity. This is why the classic mystics, Teresa included, always stressed that our feelings and any experiences of God are not indicators of spiritual depth or union. Rather, a genuine life is the most profound witness to a life of union with God. In a time of aridity, St. John of the Cross advised, "Be content simply with a loving and peaceful attentiveness to God." Teresa's final written work, completed just before her death, was a collection of spiritual testimonies and short writings. In one, she described her habitual experience of the indwelling Trinity. I have experienced the presence of the three persons up to this day. It seems those three persons, being only one God, were so fixed within my soul that I saw that were such divine company to continue, it would be impossible not to be recollected. On her deathbed in Alba, surrounded by her sisters in the Carmelite order, Teresa's last words were recorded. She said, "My Lord, it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. O my Lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time to meet one another." And then she died. October 4th, 1582. The calendar reform meant the next day was October 15th. Her body did not decay. Witnesses documented that 9 months after burial, when her coffin was opened, her body was intact. The sweet smell of flowers filled the room. This was verified multiple times over the years. Her body remains incorrupt to this day, preserved in Alba de Tormes. But the real legacy is not the incorrupt body. It is the interior castle. It is the way of perfection. It is the life written by herself. It is the roadmap she left for anyone who would follow her through the dark night. It is the answer Jesus gave her when she asked where he had been. "I was closer to you then than I am now." In the Carmelite archives in Avila, there is a letter Teresa wrote to one of her spiritual daughters in 1579. The letter discusses the experience of the dark night and how to endure it. She writes, "My daughter, do not think that because you feel nothing, God is absent. He is working in the deepest part of your soul, deeper than you can perceive. The darkness you feel is the shadow of his overwhelming light. The silence you hear is his voice speaking to depths you have not yet discovered in yourself. Trust that he is there, even when every feeling tells you he is not. Especially then, for feelings are not faith, and union with God is not built on consolations. It is built on naked trust in the dark." That letter remained mostly unknown for centuries. It was rediscovered in 1947 during renovations of the Carmelite convent in Avila. Scholars verified the handwriting as Teresa's. The date placed it 2 years before she began her final foundations, written when she was 64 years old and her health was failing rapidly. The advice she gave her spiritual daughter was the distillation of everything she had learned in 46 years of religious life. 18 years of darkness followed by 27 years of light, and the understanding that the darkness had been the greater gift because it taught her where God truly was. Her autobiography, written between 1562 and 1565, was completed under direct orders from her confessors. The Dominican friar Pedro Ibanez and the Jesuit Francis Borgia insisted she document everything. Spain was in the grip of the Counter-Reformation. Anyone claiming mystical experiences risked being labeled a heretic, but she wrote it all down, every vision, every moment of darkness. In chapter 9 of The Life, she describes the moment of her conversion in 1555 with brutal honesty. She was held back by a strong desire to be appreciated by others. She craved human approval. This vanity had hindered her spiritual development for years. When she saw the statue of the sorely wounded Christ, something broke. The egoism that had chained her for decades suddenly lost its power. She saw Christ suffering and realized her entire life had been about protecting herself from suffering. After the statue, she lived for God alone. In chapter 28, she describes seeing Christ in imaginative visions. She writes, "I did not see these visions with my bodily eyes." But the image was so clear, so vivid, so alive that she could not doubt it was real. If what is seen is an image, it is a living image, not a dead man, but the living Christ. He makes it known that he is both man and God, not as he was in the tomb, but as he came out after his resurrection. But Teresa emphasizes that the visions were not the goal. They were tools. God used them to teach her, to encourage her, to correct her. The real work was happening in the darkness, in the silence, in the times when she felt nothing and had to walk by faith alone. In chapter 32, Teresa describes a vision of hell. She writes, "While I was in prayer one day, I suddenly found that I had seemingly been placed in hell. I don't know how to give a sufficiently powerful description of that interior fire and that despair. I felt myself burning and crumbling. The worst was that interior fire and despair. Being in such an unwholesome place, so unable to hope for any consolation, I found it impossible either to sit down or to lie down. Those walls, terrifying to see, closed in on themselves and suffocated everything. There was no light, but all was enveloped in the blackest darkness. She saw hell, and the experience convinced her that the worst suffering on earth is nothing compared to a soul separated from God for eternity. After that vision, no earthly trial could shake her, because she had seen the alternative. The dark night was a gift. In the dark night, God was still there. Hell was the place where he was truly absent. Teresa developed a system for discerning true visions from false ones. True visions from God always leave the soul more humble, more loving, more obedient. False visions leave the soul proud, agitated, disobedient. True visions bring peace. False visions bring anxiety. She also notes that true visions always draw the soul deeper into Christ's humanity. God desires that if we are going to please him and receive his great favors, we must do so through the most sacred humanity of Christ, in whom he takes his delight. In The Way of Perfection, written between 1562 and 1566, Teresa addresses how to pray when prayer feels impossible. She tells her sisters, "For mental prayer, in my opinion, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him, who we know loves us. The important thing is not to think much, but to love much. Love is not great delight, but desire to please God in everything. Prayer is not about having mystical experiences. Prayer is intimate sharing between friends. Spending time with someone you know loves you, even when you cannot feel that love, even when the silence is crushing. Because the truth of God's love does not depend on your ability to feel it." She also addresses distractions in prayer. This intellect is so wild that it doesn't seem to be anything else than a frantic madman no one can tie down. But she does not tell her sisters to fight the distractions. She tells them to accept them, to bring them to God. The battle against distractions is often just another form of self-focus. True prayer is about having a willing heart. In her letters to her spiritual directors, Teresa repeatedly asks for guidance. She writes to Father Alvarez, "I don't know what is really happening to me. My very life seems so contradictory." She writes to Father Gratian, "Jesus, don't let my soul be deceived, nor let me deceive anyone." She submits everything to her confessors. She obeys even when they tell her to make the obscene gesture at Jesus. Humility and obedience are the only safeguards against spiritual deception. This humility makes Teresa's mysticism trustworthy. She never claims to have all the answers. She simply reports what happened and asks for help interpreting it. She writes in The Interior Castle, "I am not meant for writing. I have neither the health nor the wits for it." But God commanded her to write, so she wrote. What she wrote has guided millions through the dark night for almost 500 years. Teresa reached the seventh mansion. She lived the last years of her life in spiritual marriage with God. She describes it as ineffable, beyond words. The soul who is dissolved into God reemerges with a vibrant wakefulness. There is now a permanent place of peace from which the soul can approach day-to-day tasks and responsibilities. The soul knows the beloved lives inside and will never leave. But even in spiritual marriage, Teresa continued to suffer physically. Her health never improved. She traveled constantly, founding convents, dealing with opposition, writing letters, managing crises. She was exhausted, in pain. But she came to understand that physical suffering was part of her union with Christ. He suffered. So she suffered. Not as punishment, as participation, as solidarity, as love.